everyone, and welcome to ISPI. I'm Filippo Fasulo, co-head of the Economic Center. We are here today for a MED event, Redesigning the Future of EU-Maghreb Trade. This is an event that is in preparation of what? Of our flagship event, Rome Med Dialogues, to be held in Rome on November 25 to November 27. This is going to be the 10th edition, and we want to understand in this event what's happening in the region, in the Mediterranean region, in terms of security, in terms of trade and economy. We do know very well that these times are times of polycrisis. Many things are happening. Every day, almost, something is on the news and is challenging the global and local scenario. Especially what we learned in the last few years is that trade can be weaponized, and trade can be a relevant factor in order to address political issues in a positive way and in negative way. In this context, EU and the Maghreb region are key trade partners, and we know that a lot of things have been done in the last few years. For example, there's been placed on the establishment of sustainable supply chain, green energy corridors, and even logistics has been improved in the recent times. So the trade between the two shores of the Mediterranean are improving, but still we know that a lot of challenges are still there. Among them, we can list something like regulatory issues that are quite relevant in this moment, or investment barriers. But most of all, we can clearly assess that geopolitics is very relevant in this factor. And in terms of geopolitics, the private sectors need to play a specific role to solve maybe or at least to navigate all those kind of geopolitical issues. So make it short. Let's try to talk immediately with our guest today. I will start with Intisar Fakir, who is a senior fellow and the founding director of the North Africa and Sahel program of the Middle East Institute. Intisar Fakir, I want to ask you to describe to us and to explain to us what are the major geopolitical trends in the region and how these geopolitical trends can influence trade relations between the European Union and the Maghreb region.
Thanks, Filippo. I think when looking at the politics of trade between the Maghreb and Maghreb countries and the European Union, of course, geopolitics and geopolitical trends, as you mentioned, play a very important part of it. But I also want to maybe broaden the conversation a little bit to mention some of the other complex dynamics that influence the trade relationship. But let me start with the geopolitical factors that you mentioned. And let me highlight, I think, a couple that are particularly relevant for the Maghreb-Europe trade relationship. And that is geopolitical competition in the Maghreb, the question of migration and stability. And I wanted to highlight these two, particularly looking at the question of geopolitical competition, the concept of geopolitical competition. You know, we increasingly talk about the world in these terms, in terms of multipolarity, G0, etc., to describe a changing global power dynamic. And this is, of course, also increasingly true for the Maghreb region, which has traditionally been an area of influence for the EU and the US to some extent. But I would say that the growing geopolitical competition has in part contributed to Maghreb governments' drive to diversify their relationship, and particularly to seek out less cumbersome and more competitive trade relationships. The geopolitical competition question, I think, for Europe fits into a bigger question about the EU, in which, how does the EU want to make itself a more competitive and more appealing partner with a positive and mutually beneficial engagement model for Maghreb countries, but also beyond. I mentioned other, but let me just make one quick point on geopolitical competition. I think it's also important to differentiate what types of geopolitical competition we are talking about when we look at different parts of the world, particularly the Maghreb. China and Russia, of course, are are both present, but they are involved in very different, very different sort of ways in the region. China is focused more on lucrative economic engagement, access to and control of key infrastructure, specifically ports, key trade choke points, and of course, in outcompeting in the technology and telecom space. For Russia, it's a different engagement model. The focus is more on sort of engaging in conflict through backing rebel groups, finding ways to gain diplomatic and military influence through that particular channel, and of course also gaining access to natural resources. So here the point I want to make is that it's important to also differentiate when looking at how these global trends play out in the Maghreb. I want to go back to what I mentioned early on, which is the other geopolitical factor, and that's migration and stability. They are, of course, important factors, and unfortunately, in this relationship, they tend to really dominate the EU's approach towards Maghreb countries. The common perception among Maghreb countries is that the EU really views them as problematic partners they have to deal with because of migration and stability. In other words, the EU does not really view, or I should say, no longer views the Maghreb as an area where it can project power as much as a place it can play sort of a defensive role, or it needs to play a defensive role. By contrast, actors like China and Russia engage with Maghreb countries without this baggage. They really they tend to see the area as one where they have the potential to gain diplomatic, economic, and also military influence. But I would say, obviously, given how politicized the issue of migration in Europe is, and the reality that Europe has also externalized its border security to Maghreb countries, this dynamic incentivizes a certain behavior from Maghreb countries and even other countries, which we know, of course. And then Europe tends to struggle and sort of complain about this behavior, essentially creating a system that rewards the very action that it opposes or that it's trying to change. But the point here is that concerns about migration and broader security can take precedent over economic considerations in trade relations, and that, of course, has upside and downside for both partners. But just going back to the point that I mentioned earlier in terms of understanding the politics of trade, and the various elements that influence it. Of course, it requires a multi-dimensional lens that looks not just at geopolitics. We have to look at the EU's regional policies, regional approach, domestic policies, and of course, neighborhood dynamics. And I want to add just a very quick 2 points on EU politics and approach. So particularly on trade, there is a concern that I often hear from Maghreb actors, and that is that deepening trade relationship will require further compliance with more cumbersome regulatory frameworks, as you mentioned yourself in the introduction. Of course, it's important to mention that trade relationships vary from country to country within the Maghreb countries. But even for partners like Morocco, who have been able to navigate the regulatory system and have been able to align their regulatory frameworks to some extent, there is still significant reform that is required. There's still a significant investment in infrastructure, in human capital, and improving business practices that still needs to happen. And Maghreb countries often feel and complain about how they have to shoulder these costs alone, whether that's through government spending, businesses themselves shouldering this cost, and sometimes the cost gets passed on to consumers as well. So this is a question that needs to be addressed, particularly in the context that we are talking about of geopolitical competition with other partners with potentially lower direct compliant costs, if Europe really wants to talk about deepening trade relationships. And I want to add very quickly 2 other factors that I mentioned at the outset, which relate more to domestic and regional factors. And I would say on the domestic factor, it's important to really understand which actors are driving the understanding of interest in the relationship and how they think about that question of interest. Maghreb governments are navigating a number of different challenges, from changing global power dynamics, as we've been talking about, to geopolitical uncertainty with wars in Ukraine, Gaza, to difficult domestic contexts and pressure to improve the economic well-beings of their citizens in what is a difficult global economic context of still high inflation, high food prices, increasing economic disparities. So the pressure on these governments to deliver is high, and we see that in the stronger populist rhetoric that we hear, in the talk about sovereignty that we hear across the region as well, and in this sort of the point about kind of finding a better deal, self-empowerment, finding better partnerships, and so on. And then the final point that I would add is that, of course, the perception of the EU and the US in the aftermath of the Gaza war has really suffered in the Maghreb region, as it has throughout the broader Middle East and North Africa region. And we can, of course, debate the extent to which public opinion really drives decision making. But I wanted to make this point because I think it's still important to consider in kind of adopting a holistic understanding of trade relations and trade politics here.
Thank you, Intisar, for making this point and for your perfect description of the general geopolitical framework of the region. I want to add that whenever we talk about geopolitics and trade, especially recently, our mind goes to some words that we start to learn recently, like, for example, reshoring, friendshoring, and nearshoring. So when we talk about geopolitical competition, and from European point of view, when we look at the Maghreb in terms of trade, we think that the Mediterranean region might be a perfect location for nearshoring. This might be an opportunity, but first of all, I want to ask now to somebody who is dealing with it. So I will ask Andres Gujana, who is a global head international trade policy of PMI Impact. Welcome, Andres. I will ask you, how do you see the prospect for nearshoring between the northern and the southern Mediterranean shores? And especially, what can be the obstacles from the point of view of a leading industrial actor like one of the companies you are representing?
Thank you very much, Filippo, and thanks to ISPI for the invitation again this year to discuss on these very relevant international trade topics. I can contribute to this conversation from my global role. I'm not necessarily an expert in the Maghreb as the previous speaker, but I think I can contribute because I have a holistic view of what is happening in terms of trade discussions in different parts of the world. So to answer this question and linking this also to the comments from the previous speaker, I think it's very difficult to address the issue of nearshoring without, considering the geopolitical changes, and specifically the impact that these geopolitical changes are having in terms of new protectionist measures that are being taken, I would say, all over the world in terms of new investment restrictions, technical barriers to trade, SPS measures, increased tariffs, local content requirements, you name it. There are really a number of new measures that are, at the end of the day, intended to protect domestic markets. And this, again, I think it has definitely an impact in a relation with the possibility of nearshoring. More specifically, or more concretely, of course, nearshoring in principle, I think is something that is desirable, making supply chains more efficient and cost effective from the point of view of having a reduction in the times of transportation, a reduction in the cost associated to the whole supply chain is of course desirable. Also, the nearshoring can help to mitigate, the risks that the more complex or longer supply chains have, especially in this context that we are describing of increased geopolitical tensions and challenges. So in an isolated manner, in an ideal world, of course, nearshoring, I think, is desirable. Now, is this possible to do? I think in principle, yes, but there are clearly a number of obstacles that different companies, I think, are facing in different parts of the world, but also specifically in the EU-Maghreb region. Just to name a few, and I think this is not news. The challenges on the logistics, the transport between the Maghreb countries and the EU. That's a topic that I think is clearly making things more complex. Also, to an extent, the access to strong currencies, and the monetary transfers. This is something that is also having, I think, an impact in certain markets in the Maghreb. To an extent, and subject to the different sectors, I think also illicit trade can play a role as an obstacle to when companies think about nearshoring. So these are just some examples. But at the end of the day, if one would like to sum up or make a summary, I think the most important element when companies would look at the possibility of nearshoring would be in relation to the possibility of being part of an efficient supply chain, the possibility of having access to the input materials that will be needed to produce, manufacture in the Maghreb countries in this case, and then export semi-finished or finished goods to the EU, but also to other parts of the world. And this efficient supply chain, or the business certainty, I think, is provided by different tools. One of them, I think, and probably we'll discuss later, is the possibility of benefiting or being part of different trade agreements that provide more certainty to the different businesses that operate in the region.
Thank you, Andres. You mentioned something I think is very important. So the efficiency of supply chain. The efficient supply chain is not only probably related to the geopolitical environment, but it has a lot to do with, we can say, regional issue, regional aspects. So on this regard, I would like to ask Intisar Fakir, what do you think about the fact that, from a trade perspective, the region can be described as one of the least integrated regions? So, if we want, to establish our nearshoring investment and to have efficient supply chains, then we have to face a region that is not very much integrated. So, what can you say about that, and what do you think about the future prospect on this regard?
Yeah, so I think the lack of integration is a key factor that impedes obviously the nearshoring potential that you mentioned, but also intra-regional trade. But I would say it's a more relevant issue, and it's a more relevant question for the Maghreb itself. I think for Europe it has some benefits and some drawbacks. I think we've heard a little bit some of the drawbacks, but I will kind of talk about it a little bit more holistically. For a long time, the region has been disintegrated for various reasons. Just to give a little bit of context and kind of explain some of the causes of that disintegration. The most well-known ones, of course, are political. We know the tension and rivalry between Morocco and Algeria. The history of conflict. There is a history of conflict between the two. Border disagreements. Of course, there's the Western Sahara issue and the closed borders that have long prevented regional integration and even cooperation. Maghreb countries have also all taken different political trajectories that have really yielded different political systems and economic systems. Of course, there are notable similarities that we all know, I think, in terms of culture, language, and even similar challenges. but the different political systems have, led to, as I mentioned, different political and economic priorities. Algeria is a more state-led, socialist-oriented economic model that seeks self-sufficiency and redistribution of energy wealth. It relies heavily on the energy income, so not a lot of diversification. State-owned enterprises dominate the economy, and of course, it maintains strong protections and measures. As your previous guest spoke, it's one of the countries that does, and important restrictions to protect domestic industries. Morocco's is a little bit different. There's been more stronger efforts at diversification and liberalization of its economy, with a focus on attracting foreign direct investment, more trade openness, and of course now with the new development model, more plans and more ambition to invest in human development. Tunisia has also shifted into more gradual market reforms, tourism and industry, but also has overall struggled to support the growth in a post-revolutionary environment that is, quite uncertain, while also increasing spending to respond to some of the demands from the revolution itself. And there are, of course, practical factors that have impeded integration, which we can argue are the result of these political divergences. For example, there's still high tariff and non-tariff barriers. The regulatory frameworks are different from country to country, missing infrastructural connections within the region. I think we all know the figures. I think it's something like 2.8% of trade, a figure that keeps coming back from 2019, one of the lowest figures, of course. But there are slight variations on the bilateral level, of course, and the volumes tend to be higher between places like Algeria and Tunisia, and Morocco and Tunisia, of course. But overall, Maghreb countries have overall given up on working together and on an integration, and have focused more on bilateral trade with Europe, with China, and with the US, as I mentioned. The EU's own approach, I think, arguably has contributed to some of this disintegration, or has at least sort of disincentivized regional cooperation. The neighborhood policy focuses more on association agreements. Deep and comprehensive trade policies are target more bilateral relationships. Of course, yes, the EU has sought to create some opportunities for regional connection through mechanisms like the UMF, for instance. But I would argue that the EMP structures are not all that conducive for regional integration, and has reinforced sort of the kind of centrality of the EU and cooperation on a bilateral level, rather than countries competing, working with each other. They tend to compete for EU attention and resources. I'm not saying here that the EU is entirely responsible for the lack of integration. There are, of course, a number of several factors, as I talked through some of them, but I think this is kind of an outcome, maybe an unintended outcome of the way the EU has operated in the region. But I would say, for the EU, the lack of integration has had some positive and some negative implications. A disintegrated region, of course, does not negotiate collectively with Europe, which allows the Union to maintain dominance in this relationship. There is more flexibility and leverage in dealing on a bilateral basis. And there is, of course, some protection also in dealing on the bilateral basis, in terms of spillover of any potential economic or political crisis is limited to that bilateral relationship. It does not affect the overall relationship. But the opportunities, or the missed opportunities, rather, as you mentioned, are of course there in terms of larger markets, in terms of streamlined regulation, better infrastructural connections, as the other colleague talked about, all of which can provide a better environment for European business and European environments. So it's both drawbacks and positives.
Sure. So thank you so much. We learned from you that the integration, of course, might be the lack of integration might be caused by many factors, like for example institutional factor. So in order to solve it, we can try to think what maybe other actors, what role other actors can play, and especially in the case of creating an innovation ecosystem. So I would like to go back to Andres Gujana, asking him what big companies and corporations can do to create an innovation ecosystem in the region. And especially in this case, I'm thinking about a few specific elements, like, for example, the youth entrepreneurs, and the startup, that in the idea that maybe this might lead to a future better integration in the region.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Filippo. Look, I think the private sector can definitely play a very important role in fostering stronger trade ties between the two regions. Maybe let me just highlight a few examples. Of course, multinational companies can invest in the Maghreb region, creating joint ventures and partnerships with local businesses. This would not only bring the capital, but also the transfer of technology, the expertise and know-how in some cases, and at the end of the day can contribute to boost local industries. In the case of PMI, for instance, we have done something like this in Algeria, where we have a partnership with a local monopoly. Another example, I think, is related to what we discussed earlier in terms of supply chain integration. Businesses can, of course, integrate their supply chains, sourcing materials from one country to the other, components, particularly from the pan-Euro-Mediterranean region to the Maghreb region, and from there exporting finished products to Europe and also to other markets, as this can definitely enhance the efficiency and reduce costs. And let me spend 1 minute here in terms of the pan-Euro-Mediterranean rules of origin. Probably we will discuss later, but this is, I think, a very important example of how European countries and the Maghreb region can, collaborate in rules that, at the end of the day, facilitate in a very concrete manner the trade between the parties. Maybe we can discuss more in detail afterwards. I think companies can also drive innovation by introducing new technologies and business practices. This and the collaboration with SMEs in the Maghreb region can also support them to be more competitive. We have also this experience in the case of our smoke-free products that were developed in Europe, not only by us, but with the very important collaboration of a number of SMEs. So I think to an extent, this could be a good example to follow also in the region. Then there are many other areas, I think, that where multinational companies can support, for instance, by engaging when we have an important presence in a market. Normally, multinational companies would support local communities in areas like education, healthcare, environmental sustainability, and all this can also create, a good environment for businesses. Multinational companies can also advocate, for regulations that facilitate trade, that simplify the custom procedures, that improve the regulatory frameworks. Coordination with the government, to deal with these issues, I think also improves the business environment and facilitate maintaining a good dialogue. Creating training programs to develop skills in the local workforce. So really there is a lot of things that multinational companies can do directly, or also through different trade associations, chambers of commerce that are probably more knowledgeable in the specific markets, and that can be also active in all these topics that we are mentioning. Together with this, I think it's also important to highlight that yes, the private sector has an important role, but governments, I think, should also play a very important role. They can definitely help creating the conditions for companies to actually invest in the countries, to attract the investment. One very concrete example in this area is, for instance, the negotiations of the African Free Trade Agreement. This is, of course, not only limited to the Maghreb region, it's the whole continent, and this can represent a very, very interesting opportunities for companies from Europe that can invest in the Maghreb region to have preferential market access, not only the Maghreb region, of course, but also to the whole continent. So this kind of opportunities and the role that the governments can play to actually, have these agreements in place in a relatively limited time frame, I think is very important. Now, on the point on startup, I think this is probably, in my view, to an extent, part of the corporate responsibility of big multinational. I believe it's very important, to work together with new companies, with the new innovative startup, and encourage them to find solutions that are relevant for the sector in which the multinational company is operating. I think it's a win-win situation. In our case, we do have different programs, and we have a very concrete example in the case of Algeria, where we have been supporting for more than 3 years now, if I'm not mistaken, the Algeria Startup Challenge, which is one of the most important startup programs in the country, together with the Ministry of Knowledge and Economy. So we are working this, again, confirming that we really believe that the collaboration with startup and with SMEs is very important for the whole business ecosystem.
Thank you so much. These are some of the best practices to implement the innovation ecosystem in the region, and what the companies should do. But I want to go back to Intisar, asking her, from your point of view as an analyst, how do you assess, how do you evaluate the current innovation ecosystem in North Africa? And again, we talk about startups. Startups probably are a relevant player. So what role do you see for startups in the North African region?
Yeah, I can give a little bit of sort of context, kind of broader regional context to the excellent points that Andres mentioned. To answer your question, I think the state of innovation ecosystems in North Africa, or Maghreb specifically, is uneven. You have Tunisia and Morocco are leading, with Algeria also catching up. If you look at just putting specifically some of the indicators that we tend to look at when assessing the state of innovation, like R&D spending and patent cap application, Maghreb countries have a long way to go. But they are also trying to make strides in developing their startup ecosystems as sort of engines for innovation, with growing interest from regional and international investors, as we heard just now. I would say Tunisia probably has the most vibrant tech startup scene in the region, with a skilled IT force, and a comparatively favorable regulatory environment. The 2018 Startup Act is one of the most comprehensive and startup-friendly legislative framework that we have right now in the Maghreb. It provides a range of incentives and supportive measures, from tax cuts, salary subsidies, leave benefits, and so on. Morocco has a growing ecosystem with a number of incubators and accelerators and some funding programs. The government has tried to improve the general business legislative environment, but there is not a specific startup act just yet. Algeria has a startup scene that is at, I would say, an earlier stage than Morocco and Tunisia. It did pass the startup law in 2020. And of course, there is a national startup fund. And Algeria has also tried to improve the business environment for startups overall. But I would say that implementation is still in progress, and the overall regulatory environment remains a challenge. And of course, financing and access to financing remains an obstacle with complex regulations and currency controls, particularly for Tunisia, particularly for Algeria. In terms of financing, I would say Tunisia probably provides the most supportive startup financing with a range of incentives and a growing investor ecosystem. Morocco has tried to put some more funding into the pool, but the resources aren't just there. And of course, particularly for Moroccan startups, there is a challenge in terms of accessing later stage financing and funding, and in terms of accessing foreign investment as well. So I would say the challenges are similar. Not a lot of access to finance, or particularly later stage finance. Bureaucracy remains difficult to navigate. Scaling beyond the local market is also a challenge. So these countries will need to continue to work on their policy reforms, and private sector, as we've heard, also initiatives will be key to supporting the startup scene. You mentioned what Europe can do, and of course we heard about a number of things that private sector, big corporations can do. But I think Europe can also play a role in helping create collaboration and knowledge sharing opportunities among startups and innovators in the Maghreb, whether we are talking about networks or platforms that facilitate this sort of exchange. As Andreas mentioned, the example of Startup Challenge in Algeria. Also capitalizing on the Maghreb diaspora. There is a big diaspora in Europe that is quite active in the startup scene. They can play a role in their country of origin. These are all areas of support. And I would also add, supporting NGOs that are already leading the way, and startups, of course, that are already leading the way in innovation, especially in climate action space. This is an area, I think, where a lot of grassroots dynamism is sort of happening to really adapt to what the region is experiencing in terms of climate change, and to address issues like food sovereignty and water scarcity. And I would say, as a positive, sort of hopeful point to maybe conclude on, is that this is really an area where we see the need, giving an opportunity for civil society and the private sector to rise to the challenge. And I think there is a lot of hope and promise there.
Thank you. Before going back to Andres, I just want to remind our viewers that if we have time, there will be a Q&A session. So please write down your question. And now I have one question for Andres. So we mentioned now the fact that, of course, the ecosystem environment is vibrant, but still there are some challenges. So from your point of view, what element can play a relevant role in order to foster investment and export between the EU and the Maghreb? What would you mention about that?
Look, I think as we have discussed today, I think this is of course, there are multiple factors, If I have to highlight one, which is, of course, that I know better, and as I mentioned at the beginning, that I see in different parts of the world, is the importance of having predictability, of having clear rules on trade and investments. I think this should not be underestimated, especially because either we want it or not, there is a competition, outside, not only among Maghreb countries in the EU, but it's a global competition to attract investment, and this is happening. And for businesses, again, there are of course multiple factors to decide where to invest, but one of them, and I would say one of the important factors, has to do with the predictability and the certainty that your investments will be respected, and that the plans that you have a certain degree of predictability. So in this regard, and I mentioned before, the importance of building or supporting this network of rules through the free trade agreements. I think we know, that Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, they have agreements of different characteristics. In this case, with the European Union, most of these agreements were signed more than 20 years ago. There have been subsequent conversations, in some case, upgrades. But I think it's important that these countries, and ideally as a region, could have a common set of trade rules with the European Union, with new standards equivalent to the agreements that the European Union is negotiating with countries in other parts of the world. And by this, I'm not saying, and I want to be very, very clear on this, I'm not saying that Maghreb countries should just open their economies. I'm saying that it is important that the rules are clear. Of course, it's important to have flexibility in the implementation of the rules. Of course, it's important to have transitional periods in the different areas that are negotiated. I think this is very important, especially after the experience of the last years, and these some challenges that we have seen in different parts of the world on international trade. I think this should be common rules that help both the EU and, in this case, the Maghreb countries to foster trade, to foster innovation. And yes, I think this is one of the most important points that I think it needs to be highlighted at this point.
Thank you, Andres. For sure, these are very, very relevant points. So we have 2 more minutes to go, and we are receiving a lot of questions. So I will stay with you, Andres Gujana, and I will ask you to answer maybe in 30 seconds, 1 minute, it's up to you, on this question. So in what ways can large European companies like PMI contribute to the development of the labor sector in the Maghreb, particularly in terms of job creation, skills training, and sustainable practice? Maybe we need a day to discuss about that, but if you can in a few seconds, 1 minute would be good for us today.
Yeah, no, my preliminary reaction to that is that this, support, if you wish, of the labor sector is directly related to what we have been discussing earlier. The possibility of investing, of nearshoring, producing, integrating to the global supply chains. So I think at the end of the day, this support in terms of job creation would be linked directly to the possibility of investing in the Maghreb countries and producing in the Maghreb countries, and ultimately exporting either semi-finished or finished products to different parts of the world. It would be a natural consequence of that, I think.
Sure. Thank you so much. One last question for Intisar Fakir. We are talking about a bilateral relationship, EU and the Maghreb, but there is also a third actor in the region. It is China. So what should the EU do to preserve its competitive edge in the region? 30 seconds if you can.
Sounds good. Look, I think the EU, I want to also take this opportunity to address what Andres mentioned about the predictability, sort of clear rules of the game so that everybody kind of understands. I completely agree with you. I think governments there have a long way to go to really create the right frameworks and to stick to them, to implement them, and to make sure that businesses know how to navigate. And I think there are different degrees of compliance to there. But I also think there is an argument for the EU to focus on maybe potentially a higher risk approach to the Maghreb region, but it's an approach that has a lot of benefits. Strategic importance is one of them. The region is very important for the EU. The EU, I think, I would argue, should continue to invest in the region, given the economic potential, and given the fact that EU investment and EU support helps build the region's stability and and prosperity. Competitive advantage. More. Sorry.
Its time is up, so that's why you are implicitly feeling the time. But please conclude.
Yeah, exactly.
Your
but the point is, there's a lot of ways in which the EU could continue to invest in the Maghreb in a competitive way. Sorry.
So don't worry. You should find a way to better listen to the regional voices. So this is part of the thing we have to do. And this event today was about this issue. So listen to the regional voices and the companies' voices in the region. So please let me thank Intisar Fakir, Senior Fellow and the Founding Director of the North African Sahel Program, Middle East Institute, and Andres Gujana, Global Head, International Trade Policy, PMI Impact. Thank you to you all for your views and for your analysis. This event, Redesigning the Future of EU-Maghreb Trade, was an event in preparation of the upcoming 10th edition of Rome Med Dialogues in Rome on November 25th and to November 27th. We all hope to see you there. So thank you again, Intisar. Thank you, Andres. See you soon.
Thank you.